What if everything you know about history, all of it, is built on a lie? What if Cleopatra never ruled Egypt in 30 BC, ancient Rome never conquered the world, and the year you're living in right now isn't 2025 at all, but something much earlier? It sounds like madness, but for centuries, certain mathematicians, historians, and even religious scholars have whispered the same unsettling question: has time itself been rewritten? Tonight, let me tell you a story, one most historians would prefer you never hear. We'll travel through dusty archives, cryptic manuscripts, and the unsettling theories of a Russian mathematician who believes that history, as we know it, was fabricated on an industrial scale. This isn't your high school timeline. This is a riddle stretching from the Vatican's vaults to ancient star maps, where popes, emperors, and scribes may have conspired to reshape reality itself. You're watching History Footnotes and Fiascos, where today we will be diving into the chronology revision theory. If you enjoy unraveling strange stories like this, subscribing really helps out the channel. And dropping a story idea or theory that interests you in the comments gives us fuel for more content. Now on with our story. Every great civilization depends on its timeline. It's how we make sense of ourselves, how we track who came before, who ruled, and how the world has changed over time. But that timeline, it's built on surprisingly shaky ground. The way we tell the story of human history, how we date kings, conquests, and cathedrals, relies not just on archaeology or carbon dating. It depends just as heavily on the work of two men most people have never heard of: Joseph Justus Scaliger, a 16th century French scholar, and Dionysius Petavius, a 17th century Jesuit priest, were among the first to systematically organize history into the linear timeline we now take for granted. They assigned dates to ancient events using fragmented manuscripts, religious texts, and scattered records, often combining wildly different calendars from Egypt, Rome, Greece, and early Christianity into one global narrative. It was an extraordinary intellectual feat, but it was also a massive guessing game. Even today, historians admit that large portions of ancient history are based on little more than conjecture. A single misdated eclipse in Babylon, a mistranslation of a Roman document, a manuscript copied by a monk centuries after the fact. And then there's the calendar itself. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar, replacing the Julian one, which had slowly drifted out of sync with the solar year. 10 whole days were erased from time that year. Entire populations went to sleep on October 4th and woke up on October 15th. The calendar we now use is a correction of a correction, adjusted by church decree. And still today, it doesn't match up exactly with historical seasons, solstices, or the stars. So here's the question. What if the cracks in the timeline go far deeper than just a few days? What if someone, not just a pope or a priest, but a powerful network of scribes, scholars, and rulers, rewrote the script of time itself? Let's follow that question down a rabbit hole that threatens to shatter the very bedrock of historical truth. Because in the late 20th century, a man named Anatoly Fomenko, a brilliant Russian mathematician, decided to test our timeline not with guesswork, but with numbers. And what he found sent shockwaves through the academic world. Fomenko wasn't some fringe theorist. He held a doctorate, was a full member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and had a mind wired for patterns. And the patterns he saw in world history were impossible to ignore. When Fomenko began analyzing historical texts using mathematical tools, he noticed something strange. The same characters kept reappearing again and again across different centuries and different civilizations. Kings with the same names, the same length of reign, the same wars, the same defeats. Too similar to be coincidence, too consistent to be chance. He argued that many historical dynasties, Greek, Roman, Egyptian and even biblical, were not different stories but the same events told multiple times, each one disguised under a new name or context. In his view, Jesus Christ may not have lived in the 1st century at all, but may have been based on a 12th century Byzantine emperor named Andronicus I Comnenus, who was betrayed, crucified like in his punishment, and revered as a spiritual figure after death. Sound far-fetched maybe, but Fomenko wasn't finished. He turned next to the sky. Ancient civilizations often dated events by referencing astronomical phenomena, eclipses, planetary alignments, comets. These should be easy to verify. After all, the stars don't lie. But when Fomenko and other researchers recalculated these sky events using modern astronomy software, many of them didn't match their claimed historical dates. An Egyptian eclipse dated to 1000 BC, the sky says it happened closer to the Middle Ages. A Roman celestial omen tied to Caesar's rise? The positions of the stars don't match that year, or even that century. If the stars are wrong, Fomenko argued, then so is the history anchored to them. Now let's introduce another twist in the timeline. In the 1990s, German historian Heribert Illig proposed something called the phantom time hypothesis. According to Illig, the years between 614 and 911 AD simply never happened. They were added later, fabricated out of whole cloth by Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II. Why? To make it appear that they were ruling in the sacred and symbolic year 1000 AD, a millennium after the supposed birth of Christ. By retroactively inserting 3 centuries of fake history, they could legitimize their power and fulfill prophetic expectations. And most people would never know. That would mean that Christopher Columbus did not discover America in 1492, but in 1195. America did not gain independence from Great Britain in 1776, but in 1479. And that would also make this year not 2025, it would make it 1728. And then there are the monks. In the medieval world, the church controlled the production of manuscripts. They copied texts, translated chronicles, and in some cases may have written history to suit their purposes. If, for example, you wanted to establish divine right for a king, what better way than to invent an ancient ancestor who once ruled in glory? If you needed to align prophecy with power, what better strategy than to retrofit biblical events into an invented antiquity? Entire empires could be granted legitimacy by simply existing further back in time than their rivals. And if the only people writing history were the ones who benefited from it, how could we ever be sure what was real? At first glance, these theories seem outrageous, but the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to shake the feeling that something doesn't quite add up. Now, before you dismiss all of this as modern madness, here's where things take an unexpected turn. Because long before Fomenko, long before phantom time or recycled emperors, there were respected voices in history, scholars, priests, even scientists, who quietly raised their hands and asked, what if this timeline is wrong? Let's start in the 17th century with Jean Hardouin, a Jesuit priest and librarian to the King of France. Hardouin believed that nearly all of classical literature, everything from ancient Greece and Rome, was a forgery, fabricated by monks in the 13th century. His conclusion? That most of the ancient civilization was a religious and political myth, carefully designed to create continuity where none existed. Then there was Isaac Newton. Yes, that Isaac Newton. In his lesser-known work, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, Newton argued that ancient history was stretched out far too long, and that Egyptian, Greek and Hebrew timelines had been grossly misaligned. He used biblical references and celestial data to attempt to correct the record. In the 19th century, Edwin Johnson, a British philologist, claimed that early Christianity as we know it was invented by monks during the Middle Ages. He said the Church had rewritten its own origins to legitimize its power. And long before Fomenko, another Russian intellectual named Nikolai Morozov proposed that many ancient events were misdated based on faulty astronomical interpretation, and that the entire historical timeline could be compressed. These weren't internet cranks or conspiracy theorists. They were insiders, intellectuals, people trusted to preserve and protect the truth, and yet they all looked at the timeline we inherited and saw something that didn't belong. So let's ask the next uncomfortable question. If someone did rewrite history, what would they stand to gain? The answer is chillingly simple: control, legitimacy, power. Imagine you're a ruler in the 10th century. Your claim to the throne is shaky. Your people are divided. But what if you could trace your lineage to an ancient hero, a king of mythic virtue who ruled centuries before? Invent that ancestor, slip him into the timeline, and suddenly your rule has divine weight. You're not just a leader, your destiny fulfilled. Or picture a religious authority. You've declared that a prophecy has come to pass, but the timing doesn't quite line up. So you adjust the dates, insert a few events, make sure that history bends just enough to validate your present-day truth. This isn't science fiction, it's strategy. In the medieval world, the Church controlled time itself. They decided when the year began. They named the centuries. They copied the manuscripts. And in doing so, they had the power to reshape the past in order to sanctify the present. Even the introduction of the Gregorian calendar, with its missing days and papal edits, shows how easily time could be manipulated with the stroke of a pen. But it wasn't just about religious authority. It was about the psychological need for a cohesive narrative. A clean arc of civilization that began with creation, passed through empire, and delivered humanity to its supposed modern apex. History had to feel ordered. And if it meant inventing a few centuries to smooth out the wrinkles, well, who would notice? Who would? So here we are, standing at the edge of the historical abyss. Let's ask the question we've been circling this whole time. What if it's true? What if the centuries we take for granted, Rome, Greece, early Christianity, the Dark Ages, were partly or even entirely fabricated? What if we've been living inside a storybook, one written not by history but by politics, religion and ambition? If the chronology revision theory is even partly correct, the implications are staggering. What does that do to archaeology? To the dating of sacred texts, to the origin stories of entire nations and faiths? How much of our modern identity is built on a carefully arranged illusion? Even worse, if we were wrong, would we even know? Because the truth is, most of us don't date history ourselves. We inherit it. We're told the year, we're told the century. We memorize it in school, repeat it in debates, carve it into granite monuments. But the evidence, the documents, the calendars, the maps, the math, most of us never touch it, never question it. We accept the timeline as sacred, but maybe it's just convenient. Of course, not everyone buys these theories, and for good reason. Mainstream historians point out the lack of hard archaeological evidence to support Fomenko's claims. Statistical patterns can be manipulated. Celestial data can be interpreted multiple ways. And Occam's razor would suggest history may be messy, but it's probably not a grand deception. Still, the questions remain. Why do so many civilizations seem to echo each other? Take the story of Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, raised by a wolf. Now compare it to Cain and Abel, or Osiris and Set from Egyptian lore. Repeated themes of brotherhood, betrayal and divine lineage crop up across centuries, across continents, as if they were part of the same script, just rewritten. Why do some ancient events line up with those from the Middle Ages, down to the same star patterns and symbolic language? Consider the eclipses used to date ancient Babylonian texts. They don't match the night skies of their supposed centuries. but they align uncannily with astronomical events from the medieval period several hundred years later. And why, throughout history, have so many powerful institutions taken such pains to guard the timeline and punish those who question it? That's what happened to Giordano Bruno, a philosopher who dared to challenge not just theology, but the very structure of accepted knowledge. He was burned at the stake. Sometimes questioning history doesn't just get you ridiculed, it gets you erased. Maybe the chronology revision theory is wrong. Maybe it's the intellectual equivalent of seeing shapes in clouds. But even so, doesn't it make you wonder? Because if you can bend time, you can bend everything that follows it, the present, the truth, the people who write the rules. In the end, maybe it's not about whether the timeline is real or fake. Maybe it's about recognizing that history isn't just about what happened. It's about who gets to decide what happened, and why they chose to tell it that way. So what are your thoughts? Do you find any part of the chronology revision theory convincing, or is it just intellectual fiction? Let us know in the comments. We're always watching the threads.